So that concludes my talk. And so at this time, what we'll do is we are going to transition to the Crafting Dissent panel. And I'm going to just take a deep breath as different panelists are spotlighted. And at this moment, I'm going to paste into the chat the link to the Symposium website. And I'm doing this so that you can please follow our panelists on their preferred social media. I believe it's mostly Instagram. And on Instagram, you can see their body of work. So hello, panel. I'm so excited about this blockbuster panel. I'm going to introduce you all, just your names. And then after I introduce your names, I'd like to, one by one, as an icebreaker, for each of you to please share an example of one of your craft work, artistic work, curatorial work, lecture work that you're working on right now. Just quick and brief as a way to introduce all of you all to our participants on the Zoom call. So we have Claudia Carpenter, if you can, there's Claudia. I believe she's joining us from California.
Yes, I'm in San Diego, California.
And we have Diane Ivey joining us from Massachusetts.
Hey, how's it going?
I think we have 3 time zones represented on this panel. Elizabeth Hawley, you're in Pennsylvania?
I'm in Philadelphia.
Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Yura Kim in Indiana.
Hello.
Felicity Lufkin in Massachusetts.
Hi.
Karen Hampton in Massachusetts.
Hello.
We have Sara Trail. Are you joining us from California?
Yes.
And we have Tal Fitzpatrick, who is joining us from, drum roll, Australia.
Hi.
So Tal, what time is it? Local time where you are right now?
It is 6 in the morning. The sun's just about to come up.
Fantastic. So at this point, I would like everyone to just briefly share, one example of something they are working on right now, perhaps as it relates to craft. And so Tal, since it's so early, if you wouldn't mind going first, just to help get those, energetic vibes going. Tal Fitzpatrick, please. One thing you're working on now.
Before I do, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which I live and work, the Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging, and just, acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded in Australia, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I work on a range of different projects, but right now the main thing that I've kind of been ticking over since the pandemic happened is a project called the COVID-19 Quilt, which is an Instagram-based collective project I started with Dr. Kate Just that involves creating a space for people to share their crafted responses to the pandemic. And so far we have nearly 500 contributions from 26 different countries around the world.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tal. Diane, you're up. What are you working on these days? Just one thing, please.
I will. My name is Diane Ivey. I'm the owner of Lady Di Yarns, and I am working on a project that it's called Rebel with a Cause Media. It is a social media platform. I always say it's kind of like Facebook and Reddit together. It is a platform for people in the crafting community to go to talk politics, to talk issues, and to engage in meaningful civic conversation, to change the narrative, and to be more active in the political process, not just during election season, but throughout their lives. And it's rebelwithacausemedia.com.
Thanks, Diane.
Mhm.
Sara Trail, I'm throwing it to you, please.
A current thing that I'm working on is called, it's like a two-part project called the Quilts of Remembrance and the Remembrance Project. Quilts of Remembrance are we're making full custom quilts made with clothing for victims' families who've been killed from systems of like white supremacy. So like we're making Breonna Taylor, we're making Ahmaud Arbery, we're making like quilts for, families who kind of like violently had a loved one, taken from them. And then the second part of the project is like we're doing like a 2020 version, kind of like the AIDS quilt, of also honoring victims. And again, it's not a BLM project. It's like a gun violence, it's a transgender, it's a sexual, orientation, it's homelessness, it's mental health. So it's really an all-encompassing project, from school shootings to gang violence in Chicago. So it's kind of just encompassing victims that are being killed, for the most part, who aren't getting justice, even in their death.
Thank you, Sara. Claudia Carpenter, I'd like to pass
Hi,
it.
my name is Claudia Carpenter. I am actually the operations manager for Diane's company, Lady Diane's. I'm also a crocheter, and I actually have been working on my Empower People bandana. This is also a project that Diane is involved in, where they created a website to help people craft, like knit, crochet, sew a bandana that they can wear to voting while you vote, when you march. And it's basically a project to help people get involved in social justice.
Felicity.
Hi, I'm a quilter and a crocheter. I feel kind of bad because yesterday I was wearing a scarf that I got the yarn from Diane. Her yarn is really nice. But I didn't want to wear the same thing on Zoom 2 days in a row. So I crochet, and as I sit and listen to presentations, and I teach in the folklore and mythology program at Harvard University. And right now I'm teaching a course called Assertive Stitches that's about needlework, gender, and protest in a very broad sense. And so that's kind of something I'm working on right now. And I also teach on quilt history, and I have a background in Chinese art. So my next academic paper is going to be about Chinese comic books in the 1930s.
Oh, so cool. Love it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Felicity. Elizabeth Hawley, you're up.
Hello, everyone. My most immediate upcoming project is an exhibition that's going to open January 14th at Apex Art Gallery in New York. It's titled Native Feminisms, and it will be opening, given our circumstances, in a kind of virtual format as well as in person. And I'll put the link in the chat here momentarily. And it's a show of contemporary artists whose works really grapple with intersectional issues of gender and feminism and indigeneity. And it is a show that includes several works where the artists are really referencing customs, craft customs from their various cultures.
Thank you. Karen Hampton, please.
Hi, my name is Karen Hampton. I'm a professor at Mass Art. I serve on the board of the Textile Society of America. And my latest project is moving forward, redefining the American textile conversation, which is funded by a Craft Future Fund grant.
Thank you. So yeah, so a lot of the information from our panelists will be placed in the chat. So please, everyone, keep an eye out for that. And Yura Kim, can you please share what you are working on?
Hello, everyone. My name is Yura. I'm a PhD student in informatics at Indiana University. My work focuses pretty broadly on online communities, and specifically online communities of crafters. Right now, I'm working on an ethnographic study of how knitting circles and crafting circles are migrating online in the wake of COVID and everything like that. I'm also a knitwear designer, so I'm also active on Instagram, where I talk about my experiences as a Korean immigrant in the United States and how I channel that in my design work.
Thank you, Yura. Okay, so I'm going to begin, with the Q&A portion. What I would like to do is I'll probably ask, part of the panel to answer, and then move on to the next question. If I don't ask you for your answer, but you want to answer, please let me know. And I would like to include your voices in that. Also, to our participants listening, feel free to add your own questions as this unfolds. There is a distinct Q&A phase of this symposium, but I may also be able to incorporate some of your questions from the chat in real time. So I'm going to direct my first question to Sara Trail. And the question is, why do people choose craft as a means to channel their activism? In your work, because you've been doing this for some time now, how has that changed over time? So why do people choose craft as a means to channel their activism, and how has that changed over your time?
I would say 99% of our participants haven't until given that opportunity, because inherently craft is often, an affluent, option to opt into. So like I'd say, like most people that make quilts with us, most kids that make blocks with us, most kids that make full quilts with us, it's their first time using fabric or art, because so many of the schools that we go to, art's been kind of ripped, from their schools in terms of funding. So I'd say when given the opportunity, kids definitely, and young people and people in general, like they definitely opt in. But I'd say really the socioeconomic barriers often to like, and more so quilting specifically, because I know for a fact like embroidery could be perhaps a more affordable entry point, and like DMC thread, or just thread in general, fabric, floss, a hoop, is very different than quilting when it's like sewing machine, rotary cutter, like all the kind of accoutrements that need, cutting mats and rulers and but I'd say, why do they go into craft of means of activism? I'd say for the malleability of being able to bring it to different audiences. I'd say for their familiarity with particularly fiber being a medium that like everyone has at least some experience in terms of getting dressed. Everyone's touched fabric, which is, for example, we've done workshops where one of our opening activities, we used clay. Kids were so unfamiliar with clay, like getting over the fact that they've never touched it. Like they first wanted, it was a different thing. When using fiber, it's like we can focus on what we want to say because we've all touched fiber before. It's a new art form, but it's not necessarily as much of a new medium as other mediums could be. Because like we could be the social justice, clay making or sculpture community, which again would be expressing and bringing in, a new medium. But I think fiber is definitely, it's familiar enough for everyone to get started with, but it's new enough for like 99% of people for it to still be like, an eye-opening activity.
I love that. Fiber is less distracting. Fiber as a medium is less distracting. So Tal, I'm going to pitch this to you now, and then Diane, Ivey, you'll be up third. Tal, in your experience, because you've led a number of collaborative craft-based actions, what are you hearing from your participants about why they're choosing craft as a means to channel their activism?
I think for many, like a lot of the people who participate in the projects I run, like the COVID-19 quilt or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights quilt project that I ran with another US-based artist, Stephanie Dunlop, it's because crafting is already a part of their life, and it becomes a kind of natural progression for them to use that side of expression as a site for responding to something that they're experiencing or kind of emotionally reacting to. So it to crafters, to makers, it's like a natural space where we kind of retreat to do like the self-care, but also use as a form of outward expression and connection. So yeah, I think that's a key motivator for people.
Thank you. Diane, I'd like to turn it to you now about why people choose craft. I know that you have a lot to say on this. Why do people choose craft as a form of activism?
I think the feedback that I've gotten from people with some of the clubs and collaborations that I do within the business, like we did a 19th Amendment collaboration, and I collaborated with a designer, and there were a lot of women, I mean, just basically who would email back and say, I've been so frustrated the last 4 years or 3 years with politics and what's going on, and knitting and crocheting have been a stress reliever, and I don't know how I can get involved in politics. I don't know what I can do, but I'm doing this right now because I know if I wear it, people will comment on, what I'm wearing, and I can tell them why, and it means something, and it stands for something. And I had one lady say, I've burned too many bras during my protest in the 60s and 70s, that I can knit it and wear it and not get arrested. So I feel that people in general, craft because it's a symbol, but also and it's a symbol, and people do ask when they see something that's like, oh, that is different. You can engage in conversation, and it's and I think for women as a whole, crafting has been really gender, when we talk about gender role and stereotypes, it's definitely been a female dominated industry. And it's definitely what Sara said, it comes from people who have the means to do it, but now you're seeing a shift in that.
Yeah, Karen, please.
I wanted to add to that I think that the first place that craft comes is really self-care, that there's something where people take care of themselves. But then I think that as the healing process goes on, I think that it extends to healing your environment as well as the next entry point. And it's part of becoming empowered within it that I think that it really builds.
I want to move on to the next question, but I actually want to direct the next question first to you, Karen, and then to Claudia and Betsy. And this question is, how does the process of making connect people to their histories and traditions? And when you think of this, you can please feel free to answer this more broadly or more personally, like to your histories and traditions. So how does the process of making connect people to their or your histories and traditions? So yeah.
I think that, well, I'm going to talk for myself because it really I started weaving when I was in my last semester of high school, and it wasn't until about 30 years ago when I made a real shift, because I was trying to figure out how I fit into the weaving world. And there were so few African-American weavers, and I felt like I needed to understand the narrative better. And that process of really tuning into myself led me on a journey of understanding history and doing very personal work and then historic work that told stories. Because a phrase that I live by is to be alive as a political act, and that my work is very, it's very deep and really reframing history to be an inclusive history.
Thank you, Karen.
That's great, Karen. And I think my response is somewhat similar, although a bit less personal, because I do want to preface this by saying that I myself, I am not Native. I do not identify in that way, but I have worked with a number of really fantastic Native and Indigenous makers and artists. And I think that producing work related to their culture's history and traditions, it really is a way of insisting on the continuance of those traditions today, despite colonizers' many and often incredibly brutal attempts to stamp them out, them being both the makers themselves as well as those aesthetic or artistic or cultural traditions. So, weaving and pottery and basketry and beading, it's this statement of survivance, survivance being this key term in Native studies today, that these cultures have not merely survived, but have also enacted these sort of modes of resistance against a kind of forced assimilation. And so making in this manner that resuscitates or references, sometimes directly, sometimes a bit more obscurely, these traditional or customary modes of making, I think it's a way of tangibly connecting to the past and tangibly connecting to one's ancestors while making this really important contemporary statement about survivance, that Native and Indigenous peoples are still here and their traditions are still going strong. And so it is this insistence on agency and presence. And I think that this is, of course, now I was reminded of this during Rose's fantastic presentation of her work earlier today, insisting on this Indigenous presence within the contemporary art world and contemporary aesthetics and modes of making.
Thank you, Betsy. Claudia, I'd like to call on you at this time to reflect on the question of, how does the process of making, connect people or connect you to, tradition and history?
Sure. I actually say to people that I have carried crochet in my soul from the start, from birth. I actually was born in El Salvador, and I grew up in a multi-generational home where I shared a room with my great-grandmother, and she was a crocheter. So I was surrounded with crochet in my everyday life. But when I came to the United States at 8 years old, I lost that connection, but I always wanted to crochet. I remember hooks and yarn and all the things that surrounded me that were made by my great-grandmother's hand. And throughout my life, up until I was, in my mid-30s and having children, where I said, I want to learn to crochet. I have to learn to crochet. I have to make something for my child with my hands. Even though my education is in fine art, I'm a painter. Painting has always been, for me, something that explores me. But when I started to crochet, I felt that connection again with my great-grandmother. And again, when I go back to yarn and hook, I not only connect with my Salvadorian roots and my family and those beautiful memories of sharing that time with my great-grandmother, but I also connect with my fellow crocheters, all the women who have come before me. I learned to crochet from YouTube because, I lost that connection with my great-grandmother. So for me, crochet is more encompassing of the outside and other people and new friendships and that connection to my Salvadorian roots. But painting, visual painting and watercolor is always an exploration of myself. So I feel that there's a difference there, but there's comfort in both.
I love how you draw that thread to your ancestors, but then also the contemporary manifestation of YouTube as an attempt to connect with them. So Yura Kim, I'm going to throw this at you, and then Felicity Lufkin, you're on deck. And this question is, can craft as activism actually move the needle forward on social progress? Or do you see it as more commentary than activism?
So my personal interpretation of it, and sort of what I've gleaned from conducting interviews and doing ethnographic studies. So in addition to looking at how people are adjusting to COVID in terms of their crafting circles, I am also conducting a study on how people feel about using Instagram as a tool to talk about strong issues. And I used a case study of the conversations that were going on in the Instagram knitting and crocheting community from January 2019 to currently, although it's, trickled down a bit, and seeing do these conversations actually change anything? Do these actually make any impact on how people think about race, class, gender, sexuality, systems of oppression and privilege? And from what my participants are saying, I do think it can be both. It does move the needle forward, even if it's on a personal level. So, crafters are made aware of these issues through a medium, that they might be more familiar with. So I suppose the more harsh realities of these conversations are mediated through something that's soft, both literally and figuratively. But they also provide commentary. We've seen that a lot with the Pussyhat movement. We've seen that with the influx of patterns, both for knitting and crochet, on both sides of a bipartisan divide currently. We've seen that in the ways large entities respond to those issues. So the issues that arose when Ravelry banned support of the Trump administration in any of their patterns or discussion forums in the summer of 2019. So I do think it can be both, and I do think it is significant.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd have to say that I agree. And I think one of the ways to think about it is, well, if you think about it historically, I mean, I suppose the best example of maybe a big crowdsourced craft project that does seem to have contributed to at least some kind of social change would be the AIDS quilt. Again, not perfect and not the only response that was being made to the AIDS crisis, but something that seems to have been very effective in its own way. One of the things that with the students that I'm working with this semester, one of the things that we're thinking about is how we define protest and how we define political action and what constitutes a positive result. And one thing is thinking about, like, when we think of, like, when people go to a protest, for example, what is it that they want to do? On the one hand, you might, one of the traditional political science ways to look at that has been they want the people in power to change a policy. Sometimes that happens, sometimes that doesn't. But when people, sociologists and social science, have actually talked to people who go to demonstrations, there's a bunch of different reasons for going to a demonstration. And those can have to do from simple self-expression to community building, and to also to influencing broader public opinion. And I think that obviously the use of craft isn't the only way that you can accomplish those goals or contribute to those goals, but it's one of the ways. And I think craft can also be really valuable. I mean, it's kind of a funny thing, because craft is associated with domesticity and femininity, and conventional femininity in a lot of ways. And I'm talking about a longer historic period here, that craft would often come up in political and protest contexts where women that were protesting something were trying to also assert that even though we're protesting this and even though we're making our voices heard in public in a way that isn't really feminine, we are actually really feminine. So don't discount us. Don't say that we're not, like, good women. And here I'm thinking of things like elaborately embroidered suffragist banners, or, suffragists making quilts, even though, like, I can't remember her name now. There was one famous suffragist who thought sewing was a total waste of time, but she still did the fundraising quilt just to prove that she could. Yeah, so yeah, I think it can be effective. I don't know, not as the only way. And even if I think of something like Judy Chicago's Dinner Party, which is an installation art piece and has a lot of problems in its own way, but is making a kind of historical statement about the importance of women in history And that's a kind of a political statement and a kind of a protest statement. So if we think kind of broadly about what these craft expressions are doing, yeah, I think they do make a difference.
I think Kim wants to follow up to Felicity Lufkin's comments.
Yeah, I really agree with your assessment, right? The whole idea of crafting being gendered feminine, I see Patricia Fowler also talked about it, right? There's, at least in Western spheres, the notion of craft as being a female gendered activity that is domestic, that is private, and to see it in a public sphere. So in protests, for example, historically and contemporary, right? We see it kind of transitioning. And so the transitioning of something that is private and domestic into a public sphere can be a really powerful form of protest signaling. So protest scholar Zainab Tufekci talks a lot about signaling, much kind of like how animals have bright feathers to signal particular messages. Craft can be a really powerful symbol to do that. Obviously, it's not the only way to, convey those messages, like you said, Felicity. And sometimes the symbols aren't perfect. Like the pussy hat wasn't perfect. The eighth blanket wasn't perfect. But yeah, I do think they can be really powerful physical manifestations of domesticity into a public space, making, almost a confrontational experience.
Before we move on, oh yeah, go ahead.
Can I just say one more thing? And I think sometimes the non-threatening nature of craft can make it seem like the deployment of craft is a kind of like respectability politics, which is generally a bad thing. But when I look at the work of, say, like Erica Chenoweth on protest and nonviolence, sometimes doing a respectable, de-escalating kind of a thing actually gets you what you want in the long run.
Well, then actually, before we move on to the next question, that's a nice segue. I want to ask the same question of Sara Trail, because in a way, Sara Trail, your work with the Social Justice Sewing Academy is double activist, because you're as you just said a few minutes ago, you're going into schools where arts funding has been cut. So that's activism level 1. Activism, next step up on the ladder is making these quilts. And I guess activism, yet another step up on the ladder are the messages of the quilts and the partnerships, community partnerships that result. So Sara Trail, I want to ask the same question to you. Can craft as activism actually move the needle forward on social progress, or is it really just more commentary?
Yeah, no, I definitely wouldn't say it would just be commentary. Agreeing with everyone else, I also would just, want to say, like, I think sometimes it's more than just the craft. Sometimes it's more than just making the art. It's more than just having your voice heard. But sometimes it's giving, for example, if kids are making art in a Oakland high school on how there's no, fresh fruit stands and food stands in their local grocery stores, then sometimes it's more than just making art about it and having that issue heard. But it's like, all right, let's see what we can do to crowdsource to get funding for you guys to build your own community garden. Sometimes when kids are talking about, like, homeless women in our area, they need tampons and pads and hygiene kits. It's more than just saying, hey, it's more than just bringing awareness to the problem. Sometimes it's like, even if it's just grassroots in the local community that it's coming from, sometimes it's like, all right, well, let's do it. Let's do a fundraiser. Let's have an art exhibition. Let's ask for donations. Let's ask people to just bring pads and tampons themselves. Let's sort the kits. Let's do it. I think more than, like, I think for SJSA, at least in our model and theory of change, is like art moves empathy. Art like stirs the heart, and then let's get started on the action, because it doesn't just end with the art. And so it's really about bringing awareness to the issue to get support, whether that's adult support, whether that's monetary support, whether that's physical goods and services being donated, but really to give young people the power to, like, do something about it. It's hard to do stuff without any support. So I think art is really kind of like, art moves the hearts, and then other people will care, and then we can collectively then begin to do something.
Thank you. That reminds me.
I think what Sara is perfectly describing is how, and if we think about activism in a broader sense, more as a participation in democracy and that kind of everyday action that leads to change making. I think what you're describing, Sara, is so great in that it creates the opportunity to engage in something creative and fun creates a space where we can have these complex conversations and then have the realizations that we've connected with like-minded people who care about similar stuff, and we can collectively use our resources and skills in order to mobilize in other ways that we might not have thought of. But the original way to bring people together was that kind of safe crafted space.
Thank you. So, I see in the chat, Heather Powers is referencing the work of artist Fletcher Williams III. I think Felicity Lufkin put into the chat earlier a link to an installation really connecting to George Floyd, which brings me to our next question. And, this question is up for grabs, whoever feels like they would like to go first. The question is, what role does craft play in response to violence against Black people and communities of color?
I muted myself, sorry. I want to mention an organization within the crafting community, the knitting community. It's called the Yarn Mission. And it was done out of the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And when I think about crafting and the response to particularly the Black community, the murders of our Black men and women, it really, we talk about crafting, going back to the idea that crafting has been a luxury for white women for a very, very long time, and that people of color are actually in Central and South America and Africa. If you think about enslaved Africans in the United States, we have been at as a need of not only necessity, but we were forced to work and labor to produce goods. And over the time, generationally, it has shifted for us as a form of leisure as well, and still a form of necessity. And when we think about, when I think about crafting and craftivism in the modern time, Black people in general, what I've seen is that we are now reclaiming our spot in the crafting world, right? So like when when Claudia talked about her grandmother, and there are a lot of people of color who's someone in their family has sewn, has knitted, has quilted, and it was passed down generationally. And we're using those skills to create conversations around issues that are affecting us. So the Yarn Mission, they are, promote pro-Black businesses, they promote pro-Blackness as a whole, but also anyone can go to different, I think they're in like 3 or 4 different cities now. I know they're in Missouri, that you can go sit at a cafe with that chapter and have a conversation about issues that are affecting the Black community. And you bring your knitting, you bring your craft. They're led by Black women and men who are engaged in that conversation. So I feel that we are just starting to see more Black and brown people using their craft and their talent to raise awareness of issues that are affecting us. And it's not just in the fiber arts, it's in graffiti art, it's in ceramics, it's in a whole bunch of mediums that you're seeing now that's being brought to the forefront.
Please go ahead, Karen Hampton.
I'm going to mention the Women of Color Quilters Network.
Yes.
Who right now have 7 exhibits for the year going on in Minneapolis. And that really, it's really one of the most magnificent things that, that they were able to step up and step in so fast. And really it's really because it's under the leadership of Carolyn Mazlumi, and that, for an organization that she founded in 1985, I believe. And, and really has been at the forefront of the African-American narrative in quilting for all of these years. And they exhibit internationally.
Yeah, they're an amazing group.
And there's also Sisters in Stitches. I bumped into one of the founders in Boston at one of the yarn stores, and they do work with prison inmates, mostly Black and brown men, and using quilting to tell their story about not only the story of the privatization of prison and their experience in prison, but about their life and how they got there, right? And so it's a conversation piece. So when people see a quilt, it is a conversation piece about why the injustices within this in our justice system, and for Black and brown men and women, but predominantly Black and brown men. So I mean, I just feel like we're in the last 10 years, men and women of color are now saying, I've had enough. I want to use my craft to move the needle, not only just the conversation, but hopefully to engage people to understand the policies and the also like the systematic racism that has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. So
I want to jump back in for a minute, because I think one of the things that a lot of this stuff has been going on, but it's been going on small within community because it has not been safe. Because people of color have not felt safe and secure in terms of the dealing with the predominant culture. And so they've worked in small communities and have made their craft. And I think that, that really what we've seen is an allyship that's built, that's really come about. And that's where trust is starting to really come through. And I think that's why we're starting to see and hear more in the general sphere.
Yeah, and I think there are always problems with like historical erasure, like communities come forward and then they get kind of pushed back down again, and they know what they're doing, but in terms of a broader, like a nationwide conversation. And I think I think the quilts coming out of Gee's Bend, or the Gee's Bend community in quilting, is kind of a really interesting example of that. The first time those quilts really kind of hit a kind of a big public stage was actually during the civil rights movement, when they were auctioned. There were a couple of very influential auctions in New York. They were sold in New York City to raise money for the civil rights movement. And that wasn't on the scale of something like, being exhibited at the Whitney Museum of American Art. But they had this kind of vogue, and then they kind of became less fashionable, and then they became fashionable again, and they keep getting sort of redefined like what they are, but the tradition on the ground has kept going, and then it keeps getting written into and written out of like a larger narrative of American culture. And I think that that's something that people are struggling with, like, how do we really tell the story of American, like, quilt making, for example, and make it really be as inclusive as it should be.
I think that the women of Gee's Bend, that one of the things that's happened there over time is it's been outside forces advocating for them. And it's like they've finally, at this point, they've had the successes that have allowed them to become their own advocates. And that is really different when you're looking at voice.
Yeah. And it's been like a really, really long process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask one more question before, opening it up to the chat. Excuse me. And so, and here's the question. And I guess I'll ask Tal Fitzpatrick. I'll put you on the spot first. So in my talk that I gave a few minutes ago, I spoke about craft activism as self-insertion. One is a member of the, you know, whether one is considers oneself to be an inside member of the group or not. So what do we need to do to be careful when engaging in craft activist work in different?
Yeah, I think that's like a really important question that we need to reflect on in a much broader context, not just in the context of our crafting and the way we think about our activism, but the way that we do allyship in day-to-day life. And I think that there's a really important level of consciousness raising going on at the moment. I feel this, you know, coming out of the States, I have to say, the past 4 years have been a lot to watch from a distance, but there's, you know, particularly, you know, Instagram is where my kind of craft community sits, particularly now we're in a pandemic, and there's been so much rich knowledge and kind of truth to power being shared at the moment. So for me, it's to listen, and the thing that I think is most important is to take responsibility and learn to apologize and admit you're wrong when you've made a mistake, and try again and try to rectify that. Learn how to say sorry properly, I think, is really important. But yeah, for me, it's all about like listening, and not preemptively acting or making any assumptions. It's about opening communications with the communities that you're trying to work with or support. Yeah, it's definitely, don't ever speak for others, but that's all stuff that I'm like taking in from the people who are doing this consciousness raising work. So I think, yeah, engage in that.
I would like to ask the same question of Claudia Carpenter. You know, if we think about self-insertion and doing craft work, what do we need to be careful of when we engage in this work?
So I consider myself a baby craftivist. I really do, because I think that I've been making art, like I said, always exploring the inner workings of my mind. But now that I'm in the fiber community and, you know, going back to the Pussyhat movement, when I had friends just telling me to crochet these hats, and I'm like, okay, I can crochet 25 hats, right? But not really at the beginning understanding why don't you just buy a pink hat, right? So I think for me, it's like I have to as well take a step back and ask the questions and listen to and do my own research to come to where does my crocheting, where do I fit in the bigger group, right? Because I also don't feel like I can just go into a space, especially in an Instagram space, and just start spewing, you know, opinions and information that might not fit into the context of that particular post. I've seen so many posts on Instagram blow up that way and just get taken, almost hijacked, go in the wrong direction because of that. And so I'm, as a baby craftivist, I'm a listener right now, you know, and I craft and I listened, and so I observed that in that way.
I'd love to just add to that one of the things that I've been trying to integrate into my practice is actually giving space over. I think one of the most important things we can do for people like myself who have quite a bit of privilege, being white, being young, being well-educated, whatever, is to actually use my space and use my platform whenever I can to center the voices of others and let them speak in their own words, which is, for example, why a lot of my projects have nothing to do with my voice at all. They're entirely about creating spaces for other people to share in their own experiences without me filtering that in any way.
I'd like to echo that as well. Yeah, working with contemporary Native and Indigenous artists and acting as the curator of this and other shows, being very careful not to be speaking for them, not to be speaking for their work, but be acting as more of a conduit, which is a term that Karen Kramer has used, curator at the Peabody Essex, which I think is a very nuanced way of approaching that role. And I would add to that as well, those of us that are educators, professors, teachers, I think have a role in imparting that kind of sensitivity to our students as well, particularly students who are not Black, Indigenous, or coming from communities of color. That, you know, if I've taught a class on Native American art before, and I had students majoring in textiles that wanted to, you know, how do I make a Navajo blanket? You know, I had ceramic students saying, how do I make Pueblo pottery, and having to sort of explain that line between appreciation and appropriation, which is so complicated, but really imparting to those students that there's this long sort of cultural tradition that you can't just co-opt if you're not a member of that community. And I think that's a really important discussion to be had in terms of craft and craft activism and conversations we have about Indigenous craft.
I want to just chime in and say that as most of us who are on the panel or even in the audience listening, a lot of us, the crafting community, is on Instagram, and we had conversations since January of 2019 that have been, I would say, it was at a tipping point, given what was happening politically, but also what we were seeing was happening in the crafting community. And I have said that it is definitely very important to listen, but there comes a point where when you're listening, you're learning. And then when you're learning, you're implementing. And when you're implementing, you're supporting marginalized people, or, you know, just BIPOC people and the work that they're doing. And if you're listening and you're learning and you're implementing, you learn to step aside and to help elevate those voices, whether it's someone in publication or if you're teaching as like a knitwear designer or whatever, and the organization comes to you and they say, we're doing this retreat out in such and such mountains, and, you know, we'd love to have you come and teach. And you say, you know what, thank you for offering that space opportunity for me, but there's so-and-so who's a great designer who does Indigenous work, X, Y, and Z, you should have them go. It's one of the other things about the conversation that we had on Instagram that I saw last year was we were moving in the right direction and then it got derailed. And when we talk about it going in all different conversations, people were losing focus at what the core, like there was a lot that actually did come out of it, right? When we talk about craftivism, I feel like in 2019, Instagram crafting community elevated their craftivism. But I also noticed, particularly white women, I was in New Zealand in September, and I came back from September. A lot of them would say, I'm learning, I'm listening, you know, and it was repeated. And it was conversations that were getting really heated, right? You know, they were listening and someone says something and it's not done right. And social media, you know, it's really hard to really know what a person's body language is or their tone through social media. And so people make interpretations by what they see, and they don't necessarily use critical thinking, or they just react. Social media allows you to react without processing. So what I saw a lot of people as a defense mechanism was say, I'm learning, I'm listening, I'm here for you, I'm sorry. It was the same repeated words. And you have to ask yourself, was it really genuine? So I think that actually can be very, very harmful within itself. There comes a point when you're listening and you have to turn that listening into actually implementing and then giving up space to someone else who needs it, who deserves it. Yeah. Anyway.
So that's a nice you know, pitch to where we're heading next. But before I say that, I'd like to invite our participants, if you feel so moved, now would be a great time to put some questions in the chat for our panelists. And as you all are working on doing that, I would like each of the panelists to please share an example of historic or contemporary artistic or craft work relating to activism that speaks to you personally. So that does not, that is not a project that you are involved in if it's a contemporary example. So like either historic or contemporary work of craft or artistic activism that speaks to you.
May I start?
Please.
Okay. One thing that I wasn't personally involved in, but there was a movement in South Korea a couple of years ago, which is where I'm from, where in response to some new revelations being made about the use of sex slaves and other abuses during the Japanese occupation, there were craft movements that highlighted these statues in front of Japanese embassies around the world, where people would clothe them. And in response to the threats of these statues being demolished, people were clothing them and clothing them in tents as well. And they had 24/7 guards with these statues. So that was particularly very moving to me, having a history of, you know, Japanese colonialism in my country and in my family. And yeah, so that was a personally meaningful example of craftivism.
I have an example. It doesn't directly involve textiles, and I'm kind of doing a plug for somebody who was generous enough to come and speak to my class about the work. That recently in Minneapolis, in a park on the river called Boom Island, there was constructed like the first memorial to survivors of sexual violence. And it's a thing with then the mosaics, the mosaic artist Lori Green, who has a studio in St. Paul, came and spoke to my class. And she moved from originally working in textiles to working in mosaics, and had some really interesting things to say about that. But also, so that was really great, but also just, I haven't been able to see the memorial in person, unfortunately, but I find that is a project that I find is really resonant for me right now.
I also would like to share.
Go ahead, Diane.
So Candace English is the owner of The Farmer's Daughter, and she is Indigenous. She's from Montana. She's Blackfoot, and she does just really wonderful yarn. But as many of us, well, hopefully most of us know, that a lot of Indigenous women have been coming up missing and have not been found. And she has centered her work not only with the yarn, but she's started a nonprofit using her talent, her skills in the fiber arts to really like raise money, which eventually started to a nonprofit organization, using her craft to raise awareness around this issue. And she's created products in the crafting community to not only that are like nice to have, but also when someone looks at it, they're like, oh, the sisterhood, like what's this? And she can create a conversation on what's going on. And I'm just really proud of her for what she's done, because she's really, for me, what I've seen, that has been a really important conversation in the Instagram community and the crafting community that's been going on.
Wow.
And I'd also like to take the opportunity to highlight the work of Natani Nota, who is, she's a member of the Navajo Nation, and a particular work of hers that I find very compelling these days is a series she actually did in 2017. It's called Making the Disposable Sacred. And it's a series of, they're sort of dust masks that she had in her studio. And she used seed beads to bead along these felt masks. I'll put a link to this in the chat here momentarily. And it was made in response to the events at Standing Rock, the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is a fight that is far from over, although it is not in the news as much these days because she saw protesters and water protectors wearing those masks to shield themselves against pepper spray that was being used against them. And it's this piece that really speaks to her solidarity with the people, you know, fighting on the front lines there, that she couldn't be there in person, but felt a strong solidarity with. And I think there's a kind of cathartic aspect to the beading process as well, and the importance of that matrilineal tradition for her. And now she has spoken of this work in recent months about how these masks, beaded masks, have taken on a new sort of level of significance here in the middle of the COVID crisis, during which so many Indigenous communities have been affected disproportionately, and the Navajo Nation has, in particular, been really struggling. So now these masks have taken on this new sort of cadence.
I'm going to address a historic event that kind of, it is both craft and industry. And it goes back in time to Sojourner Truth and her involvement in having a weaving mill in the Berkshires in Massachusetts and weaving silk to help fund the abolitionist movement.
I'd love to share just about this Indigenous arts collective called the Jumpy Desert Weavers. They probably don't fit into like the craftivist frame as we think of it more narrowly, but in a broader sense of people using skills to empower their own communities and build kind of sustainable sources of income that also enrich their culture. The Jumpy Desert Weavers are an amazing group of artists who use traditional weaving techniques to kind of tell cultural stories and also support their communities. And anytime I talk about craftivism, I also just shout out to the Social Justice Sewing Academy because they're amazing. So I want to give them a shout out too, even though you can do that yourself, Sarah.
So a few questions have come up in the chat by Patricia Fowler, Michelle Fisher, and Jennifer Cray regarding gender and craft-based action. So for instance, Jennifer Cray writes, do any of the panelists have any experience or ideas about building support for crafting amongst male identifying individuals who are resistant due to the societal norm of it being viewed as traditionally female activity?
I could share my experience. And let's just say we've done workshops in juvenile halls with kids, with gang involved kids, with a lot of kids who, like, when you come in, you're like, hey, they hear the word Social Justice Sewing Academy. And I think they're like, it's initial turn off of like, I don't want to sew, that's for grandmas, et cetera, et cetera. But I think for us, it just became a conversation of a learning experience on one, talking about gendered language and talking about, well, what does it mean? And so it's like, okay, so if this is your perception on who it is, let's show some other artists. I think oftentimes flipping it from like, okay, we're going to have a sewing circle, guys, to like, we're going to be textile artists, or even better, we're going to be like fabric artivists right now. I think sometimes just flipping the narrative to become more encompassing. I think sometimes kids aren't necessarily as analytical. I'm talking about like 18, like and under type, young people. I would just say, like, in general, sometimes just having that conversation, but really kind of moving it into a learning moment of like, well, why do you think it's, associated with this? Well, who's told you that? Well, what's reinforced it? Well, let's actually look on a global scale, who are some of the leading designers, who are some of the, Zach Posen, like we can look at Project Runway, we can talk about so many different, I think sometimes just having a conversation and not trying to like, necessarily change them on the spot, but understand like you have a really myopic view. You're looking from like this with like, like a binoculars on, and it's like just, widen your lens.
There's an organization in the crafting community that's just gotten started, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what she does. But I know that it's called the Be Seen Project, and it focuses on BIPOC craftivists like makers. And she has, it's from Mindy Sona. She promotes their work, and there have been several men so far that she has highlighted in that space. And so, you know, that's like a resource to go to. And I agree with what's, you know, what Sara is saying, like, you know, just having that conversation, pointing people out, and also looking at like the Be Seen project is another area you can go to, you know, point to say like, see, this person is male, does crafting, or he's a craftivist. Like they're starting to see that kind of conversation happen. But I think it's a lot of work that we still have to do around that. It's a lot of work.
Well, and I think maybe Rose Simpson made this point a little bit too, that there's a certain amount of work to do about questioning like the association of some crafts as being just male domains, you know, from tattooing to, you know, car painting to whatever. You know, a lot of times like women can do all that stuff too, and often do, and do they get the equal amount of attention? So this isn't just like, it never occurred to guys to do this stuff. I mean, that we are talking about disrupting systems of power here.
I low-key want to add that I kind of like that there's an inherent bias within many craft practices towards women, because there's so many spaces politically in particular, if we're talking about activism, that are the other way and are inherently biased towards men, that I love that it's a space where women feel more comfortable and confident, and there's like a majority of women and non-gender conforming, you know, queer people who feel like they have more ownership and more of a voice in that space. I kind of like, yeah, low-key like that there's a space where that exists, and I think that's useful in some ways.
That's terrific. Well, thank you so much. I mean, whoops, we're about a few minutes past time. So now we are in the official, you know, Q&A period. So I think at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Layla Cartier and Elizabeth Agro. And I think we might get a few more questions from our participants.
I'll just make a comment. So that concludes the presentation portion, and we should give a virtual round of applause. I'll clap for all of you out loud. Thank you so much. That was really amazing. We're going to keep the Q&A just going. If there's any other questions that from this portion or earlier that we want to ask our presenters, this is the time. We'll give it a few minutes and then I'll make concluding remarks. Let's see. There are, I might read a few of them. Let's see. I'll point everyone to Michelle Fisher. Thank you, Michelle. Is it fair to say that craft activism is a space that is heavily non-male because it is a place that protests systems of power that are male dominant? Great question. As a museum curator, which she is at Boston, I'm interested in how this work does or does not show up there, because museums and museum collections are still heavily male. Very true. Anyone would like in the panel or like to respond to that? Or just nod your head that you agree? With lots of compliments, saying wonderful discussion and thank you.
I'm just thinking about Michael's question.
That's fine. I'm pausing while I'll do that while you think.
Yeah, you know, it's one of the things, in that I know this is something that we've talked about, like some of these panelists have talked about this before, like the level of like excitement about the Pussyhats, and then the sort of the pushback, and where it started getting critiqued and the flaws within that project got pointed out. And I still feel a little bit like the critiques are totally valid, but I also think that there's a level where there's a certain kind of piling on, because obviously if women did it, they must have done it wrong. You know, and I'm just, maybe that's like a super stupid thing to say. But that's been a very interesting thing for me to look at and like kind of sit with that and think about how my opinions about that have changed over time. And that's been something that at least some museums, I know like Beth McLaughlin from the Fuller Craft Museum is here with us today. And I know they've collected Pussyhats, and Victorian Albert has collected Pussyhats. So like those things are kind of getting into museum collections, but quilts and all that, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I mean, the Philadelphia Museum of Art has a very large quilt collection, and you know, one could have they been. I mean, I am not a quilt expert, and I will not. I'm just making a broad comment. I mean, have they been explored to think about sort of activism and political? Probably likely in those communities, but I mean, have we seen that in major exhibitions? I'm not sure that we have. That's something that could be interesting. Those PhD students out there are looking for dissertation topics. You know, looking backwards, looking forwards, and looking to today, you know, what's going on in that medium.
I think it's really a question for curators at that point, because the work is being made and people are using these practices to talk about the things that are really important to them and happening in their communities. But yeah, the question is curatorially, who's making space for that and who's collecting that? So I know that here in Australia, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights quilt project, for example, was collected by the Museum of Democracy, and I've had quite a few. There's that's in Canberra, and I've done some projects with another Museum of Democracy in Adelaide. But that's almost like, that's again sitting it outside that kind of fine art or art space. So it's not sitting in a art collection, it's sitting in like a historical, political kind of context. And I think that's an interesting question for curators.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, you know, in our museum, those collections reside with the Costume and Textiles Department. So it's like, it's also has medium specificity where it gets lodged and potentially log jammed and not looked at in this way we're discussing it today, you know, which is a problem of how museums are formed on the inside, what you don't see, right? Okay, here's a wonderful comment from Karen Macker. Something in these discussions that we aren't necessarily articulating, but worth mentioning, is how craft has always been a place to interrogate how class manifests in cultural production. And I think that is a very good point. Lots of things in the chat.
That is something that I mentioned in the book that I was, you know, that Hinda put together, the Crafting Dissent. You know, I mentioned that before, that like we're starting to see this the cultural shift where, you know, people of color are doing it for leisure, but at the same time, you know, that like the class divide and whatnot that crafting can be. And that conversation has not stopped. It's still going on, particularly in the Instagram crafting sphere, where we talk about the affordability of craft and who can do it and whatnot. And it's, you know, a lot of it boils down to equity and capitalism. And it's something that we need to, you know, to discuss a little more. I just wanted to chime in. Felicity talked about the Pussy Hat movement, and I think, you know, for her assessment, I think that that's great and something that I had thought about as well when we were doing the Empower People project, which was the purple bandana. You know, we Casapinka, who's a knitwear designer, and we had a conversation right after the murder of George Floyd that we wanted to bring the crafting community together so they can get out and vote. And there's, you know, there are 4 founders and like and 7 or 8 contributors, and I think 8 out of 11 of us are BIPOC, and we were very. I think the Pussyhat movement was like out of like grassroots spur of the moment, out of rage and anger of the results of 2016. And here you have the Empowered People project that was actually thought out a little bit more. And there was a call to action. There was you know, the color had a meaning. It was going to be a hat. Was it going to be a bandana? What were the expectations and how it grew? When we go on Instagram now and see how thousands of people have done it, and now the color purple has been a real big symbol for this year's, I think, election, also says something to that. So.
Well said. There have been lots of comments in the chat about the link of gender to fiber and textile-based work. And Nava Milliken, our director of the Center for Art and Wood, she comments that these distinctions do specifically apply to textiles. However, a broader look at other material-based and craft-based traditions might yield a very different discussion. And she will be in our November 6th presentation. So she looks forward to having a chance to further complicate thinking about overlaps between social practice, activism, and craft. So I hope you all out there will join us again next Friday when she will give her presentation. Let's see, trying to keep up with all the comments. There's been a lot of wonderful things. Well, anyway.
Can I make a comment
Please.
about some of the commenters are talking about class, and I do want to revisit the issue of class and how tricky and sticky it is with the threads of, capitalist culture, neoliberal culture, but also, you want to support indie dyers. Of course, we have an indie dyer and a business manager here in this forum. It's expensive to do that work. But on the flip side, you can go to Michael's and buy a skein of acrylic yarn, which is not good for the environment, for $3.99 on sale. And so it's just this, I feel like it's a tricky web of wanting to support, independent businesses, women-owned businesses, and then the system that we're up against that, if not diminishing that work, certainly makes it much easier and more accessible to buy mass-produced work that is, leading to textile waste and killing our planet. So, it's, the issue of access, but the more artistic production of yarn, I think is a really tricky one.
I think
if I may add to that. Oh, I'm sorry.
You go.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think class is definitely, like Diane mentioned, it's still being talked about a lot on Instagram. I think another thing that we have to take into account, especially in handmaking communities, is representation in terms of size, right? Poverty and body size are closely linked. And, when we see the same images of thin white women modeling clothing that is made from artisanal yarn, obviously there is an artistic and labor component to indie dyed yarns, and makers should be compensated fairly. But I think it all just boils down to representation and normalization of different entry points in terms of budget and size, and etc. And I say that as a person with relative thin privilege, but I have talked with a lot of my larger friends who do feel like they are being pushed out of a market where they've used to be a strong member of the community for necessity reasons, right?
I'd also like to add, though, that we are seeing movement in a positive way in the sense that some dyers now will offer discounts in terms of if you're, if you need a sweater's quantity, and perhaps, at the thinner size, you might need 6 balls of yarn, but at the other end of the scale, you might need 12 or more. And so I think that the conversations that happen on Instagram have moved that in a positive way, because we are seeing not just dyers, but designers as well, design in more size inclusive patterns. It's no longer small through large. Now it's like 5X. And so that is also, I think, opening up a bigger range of possibilities for all crafters.
And if I just want to add a little bit too here is like thinking about labor a lot more broadly. And I think the example of the recent, there's been a lot of great work among people who quilt or have sewing machines and huge fabric stashes when masks were simply not available in stores. There's these great projects. Here we have the Boston Area Mask Initiative that had coordinated the making and distribution of masks to nonprofits, prisons, schools, grocery store workers, whoever needed a mask. And then it's like, yay, we're mask makers, yay. Well, and now people are still making masks, but it's like you can get a pack of masks, at Old Navy for like, you can get like 7 masks for $5 or something. Somebody's still sewing those masks. And are they being treated as like heroes? And I'm basing this is an article by what is her name? Min Fan, I think. So people are starting to write about this. And so it's something that I'm thinking about kind of relative to activism, is this question of whose work gets celebrated, whose work is important. And that even, so that these are very complicated, really deep-seated problems that we have.
I really like that, Felicity.
That's really great. We need to wrap this up. I'm so sorry, but I love what you just said, and I think that's a really great place to put a pin in our conversation. So in my remarks are, thank you, everyone. Thank you for our speakers and our participants, and for everyone that has joined us today. We've truly enjoyed spending this afternoon with all of you. Please remember to visit the Philadelphia Museum of Art. We are open and also online, and we, as well as craftnowphila.org to learn more about their work in advocacy. I hope to see you at more of our upcoming programs that continue next week. In the spirit of Halloween, I'm going to put my hat on, and I'm going to invoke Linda, the Good Witch of the North, and wave my magic wand over all of you. Please be safe, healthy, and in these next week or so, challenging days that are ahead, to know your mind and heart, and most of all, have courage. And now I'd like to invite everyone to unmute themselves for a minute and say hello to our presenters and to the audience, and just ask, let's just have a moment of being rambunctious. And Layla, I don't know if you want to say another moment of farewell.
Thank you, everyone, so much for being here. The presentations this afternoon were absolutely outstanding and exceeded my expectations. Everyone, thank you so much. Please join us again next Friday. We wish you well between now and then, and I invite all of you to say hello to our presenters and each other.
Thank you, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Incredible.
It was
Thank
great.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fabulous.
Very
Thank you so
interesting.
much.
Thank you. So interesting.
Thank you.
Very rich.
My host has has disabled my video. Right.
Hi, Helen. How are you?
Hi, Helen.
My host has disabled my video.
You
Layla?
should be able to turn it back
Hi,
on.
Helen.
Hi, who is it? I'm in
Helen,
the dark.
we just asked you to start your video again.
Okay, how do I do that?
You should get a pop-up that
I think
says
I'll weave it instead.
okay.
Thanks
My
for joining
grandmother,
us.
my grandmother was a quilt maker in Boston, and she made a quilt from 1903 to 1916 or 17 that was an award winner. And they had embroidery and quilting societies in Feline's basement in Boston, where women congregated and they made wonderful things together. They even dyed their own silks by boiling onions and pulling morning glories through a mortar and pestle. It's really interesting if we go back into that history. We forget how essential working with textiles was to the female community at that time.
Do you know why they chose the Filene's basement? I mean,
Yes, I
just 'cause
do.
the location was convenient, or is
No,
it?
because Filene's gave them the basement in order to meet, and they would meet there.
Like, was that in like downtown Crossing area? Like,
I missed Filene's. Was it still on downtown Crossing, or did it move? Or was it another location?
It was. This is 1903. 1903, 1910, 1920. It was the old Filene's basement.
Did Filene sell fabric back then? I wonder. I'm sorry to be
They must
cynical. I'm
have.
looking
They
into the
must
yeah.
I have no idea if they sold fabric.
Like
What is
how
Filene's?
Walmart sold yarn.
I do know that many of the silks came from the Boston tie factory, which gave
Wow.
them remnants. That I do know because I remember my grandmother telling me that. And she's been dead since 1953. But I do remember her telling me that they came from the Boston tie silk factory.
You have to remember then that as a young single woman or any woman, of what you were allowed to do and where you could go by yourself. And it was respectable and allowed to go out to meet a group of women to sew. So that was the way they could escape and have a social life. And who knows what was discussed there in the private dark basement of, or probably not dark, but it gave them the freedom.
I don't agree with the fact that they came together to escape.
Well, maybe not escape, but there was no way they could go just walk by themselves and go have a coffee or a drink somewhere.
But they could also use their homes at that time. They could use their dining room. I think there was a sense of congregation, of being together, of having a congregation, of being able to talk to the people, of being able to unload your feelings privately. You know, I think that it was a kind of psychiatric experience.
And away from home family. If you had it at home, you probably would have had a mother-in-law or a mother or other people around in your circle. It just,
but people,
there's not a lot of place to be alone.
People in my generation and in the generation before me also congregated at home for book readings, for literature, for singing, for needlework, for mending, for all sorts of, for cooking. You know, it was a natural part of our lives. I don't think it was a matter of escape. I think it was a matter of the female having a very different place in society at that time, not in the working society. And this was a way of communicating, of sharing, of growing.
But you know, Helen, a lot of the women, a lot of the people who worked at Filene's were in fact women. So it's not all women, that's got a very strong class dimension too.
No, that is absolutely true. And I have a photograph, not just of Filene's, but I have a photograph of a department store in Worms, Germany from late 19th century and the early 20th century, in which women were a very important part of the sales force. And they were dressed up. You know, they were really dressed up.
The history of department stores is really amazing. They were really like third spaces before the term was in use.
Right.
They had art exhibits. There was a ton of stuff going on in department stores back in the day.
Right.
Yeah, and of course, they started by being called yard goods stores in the early 19th century. So they did, in fact, sell cloth, and fabric. As a former buyer at a Pittsburgh department store, in a building going back to 1850, it was delightful and a very, very interesting history of department stores, which were, as I said, they started out being called yard goods stores. So very, very tied to fabric and production in the early years.
But aside from fabric, it was the department stores in Tokyo that hosted the first exhibitions of American metalsmiths.
Yes, absolutely. And they were, avenues for display. And being a former, metals and crystal buyer, the displays in the department stores, were an incredible part of the visual experience. And very akin to galleries, as they continue to be in the 30s, as housewares and departments were established with highly designed goods, production goods as well as crafts. So an integral part of the American craft movement as well.